Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. In this video, we're going to be talking about God's foreknowledge and how that factors into predestination. Now, this can be a challenging subject, even for those who have training in theology, but there's a passage in Paul's letter to the Romans that helps us understand how the whole thing works. In most translations, you will find language that involves the words foreknowledge and predestination and justified and all those sorts of things. And sometimes it can be a little hard to follow. So in my translation, I tried to not use as many theological terms and make it a little easier to understand. And this is the Simplified New Testament Study Bible. So let's see what Paul has to say here. God sees to it that in everything that happens to us, there is something good to be gained. He does this for those who love him, for those who have responded to his call to come and be saved. You see, God looked into the future and saw who would be saved. Then, based on what he knew would happen, he made his decision. Individuals who would come to him would be like his son, holy and pure. When it was time, the call went out, and those he knew were going to be saved were saved. They came to him, and their sins were forgiven. They were declared not guilty and were glorified. Now, as I said, this is a challenging text, and if you throw in all those theological terms, like most translations do, it makes it even more confusing. But you may have one of those translations. The NIV, the New International Version, is a very good translation. It's probably the most popular translation in the world right now, and has been for several years. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's an excellent translation. I often use it myself. But I do have my own translation of the New Testament as well. But in some of the other translations, you'll find words like foreknowledge and predestination. I said that. So what do they mean? Well, the word foreknowledge simply means to know before. God knows before. Before what? Before it happens. God knows what's going to happen. Well, how can he do that? Well, the short answer is because he's God. But a more technical answer is because while we, as human beings, finite human beings, live within the time-space continuum and are bound by that, God does not live in and is not bound by the time-space continuum. God exists outside the time-space continuum. You see, God existed before time existed. God created time. Okay, and we live within time, so we have a past, we have a present, and we have a future. That isn't the case for God. Now, that's hard for us to understand because all we've ever known, all we have a frame of reference for is the past, the present, and the future. You know, that's all we're really capable of understanding. So when we say, yeah, but God isn't bound by those and he knows the future before it happens, that can be challenging, but we just simply have to accept the fact that God has abilities that we don't have because of who he is, and he knows things we don't know. And so what is the future to us, and therefore yet unknown to us, is not the future and not unknown to God. So God has this thing called foreknowledge, to know before. What does he do with that? Well, as we read in my translation, verses 28 through 30 of Romans 8, I translated it, God looked into the future. From our point of view, in our frame reference, he saw our future, and he knew who was going to be saved. You see, even though we don't know what happens in the future, God does. And so God looked at that, and he saw the people who would hear the gospel and who would respond to the gospel and who would be saved. And on the basis of what he knew to be the case, he then said, in effect, okay, so be it. Those people are going to be saved. Now, there are some people out there in the religious community who teach that God's, quote, predestination to destine beforehand, that is, to fix things in place before they happen, that is done strictly on an arbitrary basis, and it's based on a text about Jacob and Esau in Romans chapter 9, and I don't think it has anything to do with anyone other than Jacob and Esau, because the rest of the New Testament technically and very specifically teaches that if God predestines someone specifically, it's on the basis of what he knows they're going to do. It's not any arbitrary kind of thing. And so, some people teach that God looks out into the great sea of humanity, and he says, you, and you're all going to be saved. Like it or not, you're going to be saved. And you, and you're going to be lost. Like it or not, nothing you can do about it. You're going to be lost. So, that's it. Well, I'm sorry, but that just isn't what the New Testament teaches, and that's really quite an ugly and horrible idea, that God would condemn someone to eternal punishment arbitrarily, irrespective of anything they have done or not done. That's just ugly and makes God monstrously evil. Okay? That's the truth. That whole theory, that whole idea of arbitrary predestination just makes God quite monstrous and evil, and it is not true, and it is not what the Bible teaches. Okay? The Bible teaches that the people God predestined, he did that based on his foreknowledge of what they would do. Specifically, that they would hear the gospel, respond to the gospel, and then because they did, their sins were forgiven and they were saved. Now, you see, that's fair. That's fair. And salvation then is based upon, do we respond to God's offer of grace and mercy? And then on the basis of that response, then he knows who's going to be saved or who's going to be lost. But there's no arbitrary decision being made. It's based on what God knows we're going to do. Now, again, that's hard for us to understand, but we have to acknowledge it and accept it. And if we think about it long enough, we can understand how that works. I have an illustration. It's kind of an analogy that might help. Suppose you've seen a movie, and you went and saw it when it was first released, and so you really liked it, and you remember the movie in great detail, and you know how the movie ends. Okay, now suppose a couple of years later you see that movie again, and you're watching it with someone who hasn't seen it, and you get all excited about it, and during the movie you say, okay, watch what he's going to do now. Watch what he's going to do now. He's going to, and aside from annoying the people who you're talking to, they would say, well, how do you know what he's going to do? He hadn't done it yet. Well, you could say to them, well, because I already saw the movie. Okay. Now, did you have anything to do with making the movie? No. You weren't the director, you weren't the actors, you didn't have anything to do, you saw the movie. So you know what's going to happen. But you didn't have anything to do with making it happen. You just saw it, so you know what's going to happen. Now, that's sort of the way, it's just an analogy, and it's not a perfect analogy, but that's sort of the way God's foreknowledge is. He has seen the movie of our life, and he knows how it's going to end, even though we don't know how it's going to end. But he has nothing to do with making it end the way it ends. He doesn't make people do things, all right? And he doesn't stop people from doing things. People are what we call self-determined. They have free will. They make their own decisions. They do what they want, or they don't do accordingly, right? They do it or they don't do it, but it's up to them because they have free will. And so God sees what happens. God knows what happens, but he doesn't have anything to do with making it happen. And that's important for us to understand. And so when we think about a passage like this, God's foreknowledge is the basis for his predestination, or for his determining ahead of time what's going to happen, who's going to be saved. But it's all on the basis of knowing how we would respond to the gospel. Now, there's something else here that I think is very important, and it can be very comforting for us. Notice how he says, individuals who would come to him would be like his son, holy and pure. When it was time, the call went out, and those he knew were going to be saved were saved. They came to him, and their sins were forgiven. They were declared not guilty and were glorified. Now, the thing I want you to notice is the past tense there. It's all in the past tense. Even though for us, it hasn't happened yet. But for God, he's already seen it. And he knows how it ends. And so he says, so be it. That's it. That's how it's going to go. All right? But it's past tense. Those who are going to be saved are, as far as God is concerned, already saved. We don't exist in a state of maybe and if. If we've heard the gospel and we've responded to the gospel, it's not, we hope we're going to be saved. We are saved. We exist in a relationship with God. Our sins have been forgiven. We have been taken out of the world and put into the church, into the kingdom. And that's where we exist, in a relationship with God. And it's not a matter of if we're going to be saved in the future. I mean, unless we turn around and walk away from God, if we say, I don't like this anymore, I don't want to be here, I'm leaving. Yeah, okay, then we have the right to leave. We have freedom of choice. We're self-determined. We can leave if we want. But as long as we stay in our relationship with Jesus, we're not going to be lost. We're not going to be lost. And Paul talks about that in this chapter. He said, there's no power that can separate us from God. And that's something that we'll look at here in another video. There's no power that can separate us from God. That is outside of ourselves. We can separate ourselves from God. We can choose to walk away. But only a fool would do that. Only a fool would do that. If we understand who God is and who we are and the offer that he's made to us, then we're not going to walk away. We're going to stay in a relationship with God, know we're saved, enjoy that, relax, and live our life in service to him. This is a great passage. This is a great passage. It starts by telling us that God helps us so that stuff that happens turns out in a good way for us. Everything that happens is a test where we can prove our faith, where we can learn something and gain wisdom, where we can get stronger, where we can become better servants. God works with us to help all things that happen to us turn into something good for us. That's a wonderful blessing. He knows that we're going to be saved if we do, in fact, respond favorably to the gospel. And he saves us. He declares us not guilty. And we enjoy glorification. Even though it hasn't happened yet, as far as God is concerned, it's a done deal. And that means we can rest easy. We don't have to worry about it. That's a good thing, isn't it? That's a great thing. Well, these are my thoughts for today. I would leave you with this simple advice. Pray, read your Bible, go to church, and may God bless.